Welcome to Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning for Tuesday, January 28th. I'm your host, Tom Orr. The Texas game is in 214 days. The game against Michigan in 305 days. All right, we got to talk about the fallout from the departure of Ohio State defensive coordinator Jim Knowles for Penn State. That news broke. Well, we had kind of had a pretty good sense for it on the night before the Ohio State National Championship celebration, and then the day of the National Championship celebration, it broke just after the event ended. And so now the question is, what next for the Ohio State defense? Can we bring in on our buddy Ross Fulton, the X's and O's guru at BuckeyeHuddle.com, to try and make sense of some of the potential names on the hot board, if you will, for the defensive coordinator job at Ohio State. When we have Ross on the show, we are sponsored by Jeff Ruby's of Columbus, proudly offering nationally acclaimed USDA prime steaks, seafood and sushi, impeccable service, live entertainment, and an attention to detail that is simply unmatched. Just go to jeffruby.com/Columbus. Check out the menu and make a reservation for today. All right, Ross. So I think before we dive into some specific names here, I think it might be helpful to have a little bit of a broader conversation on the benefits of a continuity hire. So, keeping it in-house, someone who is sort of off of that Jim Knowles coaching tree, for example, versus maybe going out nationally and trying to see, is there a best available national candidate or something like that? So before we get into specific names, what would be the benefits of a continuity hire, keeping things sort of in-house versus going out and trying to do more of a national search?
I think it depends what we mean by continuity to begin with, right? Are we talking about what Ohio State was doing in the last 10 weeks of the season following Oregon 1, where they were running much more what I would have expected from a Jim Knowles defense? Or are we talking about continuity with a 4-down, 1-gap, single high concept that, I think someone like Larry Johnson would prefer to play? So assuming that it's continuity with what Jim Knowles wanted to do, I think the proof's in the pudding, right? Like, it worked really well. They came up with a good hybridized approach that kept a 4-down front while using some of the concepts of like spacing up front that Jim Knowles would want to achieved from a odd front anyways, like we've talked about, like, closing down interior gaps with different techniques so that you can linebackers and second level players can sit on RPOs or play different types of split safety coverages without having to become conflicted with both pass and inside run responsibilities. So that would be the benefit of, it certainly ain't broke. Worked pretty well. Like, don't fix it. They were able to feature Caleb Downs effectively in that system, particularly like as that middle safety and 3 high schemes or at the second level. So he's obviously going to be back. I think it's paramount to make sure that you maximize his talents. So I guess that would be the benefit. And obviously, it depends what the names are, I suppose, but finding the best available, I guess, there comes with some uncertainty, particularly if like we're talking about someone internally in terms of their experience level, right? So it's, if you find someone who's more of a proven commodity, but I think then it gets into the questions of like staff alignment and continuity that led us here in the first place.
So the two names that I've heard the most in terms of potential internal promotions are the two guys in the secondary, and that would be Matt Guerrieri, who is a longtime Knowles assistant, probably knows the Knowles defense better than anyone else on that staff other than Knowles himself, and who also has a number of years of calling defenses before. Did it for 4 years at Duke and then a year at Indiana, so he's got some experience. And then Tim Walton. Tim Walton served as a defensive coordinator, I think, on a couple of occasions in the NFL, obviously knows the Knowles defense, has coached with him for the last few years here at Ohio State as well. Do you have a sense for, other than sort of trying to read the tea leaves on Ryan Day's introduction of Matt Guerrieri as one of the best young rising coaches or whatever it was on Sunday, do you have a sense for the likelihood or maybe the fit of one of those guys versus the other?
Yeah, Guerreri is the one who jumps out to me more for the reasons. Obviously, that Ryan Day comment, can certainly overread into that, but that obviously seemed like a thumb on the scale. For the reasons you listed, though, like he's been in the Knowles system. He's called defenses before. As I've said on Buckeye Huddle and elsewhere, like I give him credit, whether it's due or not. for like, as we talked about following Oregon 1, they went from a lot of those like spot drop zone concepts to much more of matching routes in cover 2 and cover 3 and playing more cover 4 concepts where they're, carrying receivers, things we pointed out throughout the breakdowns. And the reason I do is just because like when he was at Indiana, that was, what I thought they had an effective game plan against Ohio State. He did a lot of pattern matching cover 3 in his time at Indiana. And, as the safeties coach, like that's naturally like more coverage focused, tends to, when they split up responsibilities, that tends to be where it falls. So that goes to the continuity. And obviously like he's a young up and coming person, like, it's much more of like a Jeff Hafley or even Ryan Day hire for that matter. Whereas with Walton, like, yes, he was the defensive coordinator at points in the NFL, but I just don't know if that continuity is there. Like, as you said, he's been in the system, but it wasn't like he was doing Knowles stuff when he was the coordinator in the NFL. So that I would certainly, I guess if I had to choose, like lean more towards Guerreri as sort of the heir apparent to Knowles, if you will.
So before we get to some of the potential external options, I did want to ask, okay, if you just go to promote from within, you do have another spot on the coaching staff then. You have that 10th, well, I guess I don't know if they even really are doing countable coaches anymore, but you do have that spot where Jim Knowles, whoever, Matt Guerrieri, if he moves into Jim Knowles' office, someone's got to sit in Matt Guerrieri's office. So do you have a sense for what you would do? If you're in Ryan Day's shoes, what do you do with that coaching staff spot? Do you bring in a special teams guy? Do you bring in another defensive guy? Do you promote someone and have assistant defensive line coach or another safeties coach, or what would you think they might look at doing in terms of that extra spot if they do promote from within?
I would look for a co-defensive coordinator akin to like what the role Greg Madison played, where someone who's focused in particular on the front 6, front 7, whatever term you want to use, to mix with Guerreri being a secondaries guy. In particular, as I said, like based on, Tony Government's reported others, like of the people who I feel like were less on the same page with Jim Knowles in terms of what he wanted to do, it was probably the defensive line coach and the linebackers coach. So I would, to the extent, again, we're looking for continuity with what Jim Knowles was doing, and presumably Matt Guerrieri would want to do that. Like you would want someone who has overall review of the front and the second level, who is on the same page.
All right. Now, looking at some of the potential external candidates, and it's kind of funny, you get some last names on here that you're like, hey, I think I remember that guy. And it's like, no, you remember that guy's dad or uncle or brother or something like that. But the first guy is Mike Tressel, current defensive coordinator at Wisconsin. That's a name that I have heard come up in a couple different places. He is the son of former Ohio State running backs coach Dick Trestle, a former Ohio State GA, and the nephew of former Ohio State head coach Jim Tressel. So what do you know about Mike Tressel and his defensive philosophy, and would that be a good fit with Ohio State and what they're going to do, or would that be a complete overhaul? Like where would he fit in terms of a defensive coordinator?
Yeah, I mean, up front it'd be a pretty big overhaul because he's an odd front guy. So like I don't want to speak out of turn. I can't say exactly what has happened the past 3 years, but I as long as Larry Johnson's there, I don't think they really want to be a 3-down defense. And, the argument they've made is that they recruited to a 4-down defense. I think that they have more opportunities to do odd front things next year, simply because like lack of depth up front on the defensive line. And, CJ Hicks is coming back, and I'm presuming that like the one reason he's coming back is to move to more of an edge role, if you want to use the term jack, if you will. But again, so like that's a big change. And are you willing to undertake that change now when you weren't willing to do it with Jim Knowles?
Another name that will be a last name that sounds familiar is Jon Heacock. He actually had long connections at Youngstown State, took over at Youngstown State after Jim Tressel took the Ohio State job. Remember another defensive coordinator at Ohio State back in the day, Jim Heacock. So another name that's sort of familiar to folks in the Ohio State orbit. He's been at Iowa State for a few years, and back in the post Kerry Combs days, that was a name that I had heard just sort of mentioned kind of briefly as someone that Ryan Day had maybe looked at one point and thought about at one point. Now he's still at Iowa State, continues to do a good job. In some ways, sort of similar to what Knowles ran, but in some ways not.
Yeah, I mean, again, like Space Coyote on Blue Sky has a good discussion of why Heacock would be a good choice. I mean, continuity in the sense of like Jim Knowles, when he went to the Big 12, basically took a lot of Heacock stuff from Iowa State and adapted it, like the 3 down front, the 3 high scheme, that like Aztec middle safety that we talked about, Caleb Downs playing. So Heacock's older than Knowles, so I guess to the extent that matters, but like we're cutting one way or the other. But again, like I keep not to sound like a broken record, but like some of this comes down to like staff alignment and like, I think Ryan Day 3 years ago or whenever he hired Jim Knowles, like probably should have better thought through, like, was he comfortable running what Knowles wanted to do, or did he want to be like a 4 down, 1 gap defense? There's people out there that do that. Brent Pry, others. Penn State has a long line of coaches doing that. Tennessee, as we talked about, like Tennessee does it because they came from Penn State. So again, that'd be like somewhat of a transition, like not yes and no a transition, right? Because a lot of what Knowles does is what Heacock does.
And one other name that's at least been sort of mentioned is Jim Leonhard, former Wisconsin defensive coordinator, and I believe interim head coach as well. And then when they brought in Fickle, he was not retained or chose not to stay there. He's in the NFL right now. I mean, any sense for first of all, schematic fit there, and second of all, generally, I assume when a guy goes to the NFL, he probably is not all that enthusiastic about coming back to college to do the recruiting stuff again. But any sense there at all?
Yeah, same. I just have the same pure guess that like he's had opportunities in college and seemed like he wanted to get out of recruiting and be in the NFL. Same issues as the last few days. Odd front guy, so big change. So again, it's like you gotta have alignment to start with, and like you don't want to be back in the same situation where the defensive coordinator and the assistants can't get on the same page.
If you're not going with someone internally, is there someone nationally who you think, boy, this guy might be a really smooth transition? I mean, you probably have new terminology and all that kind of stuff, but in terms of a schematic fit, is there someone who's like a best available national guy that would not be a complete start from scratch hire for Ohio State? Or, if not, you're in charge, who's getting hired?
Yeah, I mean, that's why I kind of tend to go with Guerreri, because I don't have an easy name off the top of my head. Just said, like, you could throw out Jeff Hafley and there's your 4 down, like single high base scheme. I mean, again, same thing. Like, he's a defensive coordinator in the NFL. I doubt he really wants to go back to college. Brent Pry is the head coach at Virginia Tech. So like, without going through like the entire coaching tree of everyone out there right now, there's not like a big name that jumps out to me that seems to like be a great fit. And so for my part, as I said, like the one thing I've done is like broken down lots of Ohio State games. And I like what Guerreri did against Ohio State when he was at Indiana. I like the changes they made in the back end a lot post Oregon, as we've talked about. And I like keeping, they have now a veteran group in the back end still. Like keeping those guys on the same page and assuming that they were happy with how things went. Like, I'd like them to continue forward with what they've been doing.
And is there a benefit to maintaining, I assume you'd sort of maintain the same terminology and the same basic scheme stuff. Is there an advantage to that where you're probably starting spring ball a couple steps ahead of where you would if you were kind of introducing a new playbook?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, that's why Chip Kelly didn't change the terminology. I mean, they have such a short turnaround too to spring from given we're finishing like 6 weeks from the national championship game. So I think you avoid a big learning curve, right? And again, like, to the extent it goes beyond scheme and like personalities were involved, like if again, like I can't speak to how everyone gets along with Matt Guerrieri, obviously, but it definitely gives you a leg up. Now, obviously, you have to weigh that against, like, do you think he's the right guy for the job, and can't let the short term outweigh the long term, but certainly would give you a leg up.
All right, so there you go. So there's your breakdown of some of the potential leading candidates, or at least names we're hearing in terms of the Ohio State defensive coordinator search. We'll continue to follow that for you at BuckeyeHuddle.com. As Ross mentioned there, we've had a lot of chitter chatter on our board. The Huddle board presented by Jeff Ruby's Columbus. Leonard Gerderman kind of did a notebook dump on what he was hearing and some of the stories behind the move and all that kind of stuff. There's been a lot to talk about. Can you believe it has only been about a week since Ohio State won the national championship? Feels like that was about a month and a half ago. There's been a ton to talk about there. There will continue to be a ton to talk about as we head into spring ball and all of the potential changes coming at Ohio State. There's going to be a lot to talk about. We hope to talk about it with all of you there at BuckeyeHuddle.com and at YouTube.com/BuckeyeHuddle. Thanks again to our friends at Jeff Ruby's Columbus, the award-winning upscale steakhouse in downtown Columbus. Named one of the top 50 steakhouses in America by Food Network. Just go to jeffruby.com/Columbus to check out the menu and make a reservation today. That'll do it for today. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.